Again, my name is Michael Landaway. I'm co-founder of Avanon, and we want to talk today about the trends of 2017 and the predictions for 2018 when it comes to future-proofing your cloud security. So we'll go ahead and look at the trends of 2017, look at the headlines, and many of these we remember very well, the Vault attacks from the CIA, both Vault 7 and 8. These are important to us because of the fact that these are pieces of code that can be used maliciously that were state-sponsored. Millions of dollars spent on these codes that are now in the hands of more malicious attackers. Some other breaches that took place this year that are important to us is the loss of our personal data. It could be the 1.3 billion email addresses lost at the River City attack, or probably more significantly, probably most significantly, the data breach at Equifax, which is essentially the loss of not only all of our personal information, historical information, every piece of authentication information that we would use to validate our identities, not only with our banks and with insurance, but also our online resources. Now we can see some of these pieces of malware being used in the wild. The NotPetya attack actually used in a couple of different ways. One actually made part of an accounting software update in that it was downloaded via a legitimate accounting site, a particularly targeted attack on Ukrainian users, but it bypassed most security tools because it was actually embedded in the code. Now that very same piece of software was used a little bit later, not as a piece of malware, but as a way to cover a previous intrusion. So the NotPetya wiper attack looked like ransomware, caused a lot of chaos, but that chaos was actually used to cover a low and slow attack. So as we look across the history of 2017, we see a variety of things that may not make sense from a big picture, but we're going to kind of cover what they all have in common. When we do that, we'll look ahead at 2018. 2018 is going to bring some very important deadlines for us. First being tax season. Tax season is important because that's probably where all of that Equifax data is going to go. You should keep an eye on early filings. So that is a deadline that's important to us. The PCI compliance deadline for multi-factor authentication. This is key because we should already be using multi-factor authentication everywhere. In fact, many of the attacks that we saw last year can be addressed by turning on multi-factor authentication alone. That is probably the one piece of advice I would give you going into 2018 if we were to stop right now. There are some other deadlines that are important to us as businesses. If you work in the United States, do business with any New York entity, you might be subject to New York's cybersecurity deadline, but many of us, large companies especially, have any European customers are subject to the GDPR deadline that's later this year. So while we can schedule those events, we can't necessarily schedule the bad things, the credential breach, the customer data breach, or the ransomware attack that might come later this year. So we need to be prepared to plan ahead. We don't know when they're going to come, and we can't reschedule them. So let's look at some of the 2017 trends. The first trend is the fact that the cloud is now the target. It's not just a target, as it always been, but it's going to become the target. Malware has become a commodity due to a lot of the breaches that we talked about, but the innovation now is not in the malware, but in the evasion of the security tools used to block that malware. In fact, we're seeing more fileless malware attacks that actually don't have an attachment, don't have a file, and everything is done in memory. These combination of attacks are becoming more pervasive in suite-based cloud tools for the Office 365 and G Suites, and those are the most successful methods that combine these things when it comes to targeting the cloud. Attackers are no longer blasting us with spam-based attacks. They're becoming more patient and methodical. And we'll talk about that. And then the next stage that's coming, that patience and methodical nature is now actually an AI tool. So let's look at the breaches from last year. Every year, Verizon does a data breach investigation, looking at both the incidents that were caught as well as the breaches that weren't caught until too late. And we can see that when it comes to the breaches, the web app attacks were number one. But when it comes to incidents, we can see that privilege misuse is the number one type of attack, and that's most likely due to all the personal data breaches. So cyber espionage, web attacks, privilege misuse, those are the things that we're concerned about. That's why the cloud is the most likely target for many of these attacks. And so when we, as customers of the cloud, use the cloud, we might be using business apps, communication apps, collaboration apps, or even infrastructure as a service. But we do not need to worry, or it's not our concern, to worry about security at all the lower layers. However, it is our responsibility, and in fact, if you read your SLA, it is our role to protect the data and your employees' use of the cloud. That is something we're responsible for, and that is something that we will, and not only do we need to address, but it's also the most likely target. Of all the targets last year, very, very, very few, less than 1%, actually attacked the SaaS itself. All the attacks, most of the attacks were on the people or the data. So, as we've mentioned before, malware has become a commodity. We can go to GitHub and pull down malware in a number of different repositories. The nation-state breaches have built an underground ecosystem for a lot of this malware. Now, some of this might be old, targeting old vulnerabilities, and which is why it's our responsibility to make sure we are always patched, always updated. Many of the attacks of last year could have been prevented with just patch management. But what's happening now is that people are purchasing multiple of these tools or borrowing multiple of these tools and customizing them and using multiple vulnerabilities in order to have a single attack that might find multiple holes within, or one out of multiple holes in the system. So, in fact, we can see that now we have marketplaces, and you can see that some attacks on Windows machines, Linux machines, are relatively cheap, whereas others are more expensive. There is an economy here in which the malware creators may not be the malware users. In fact, we can see here that iOS, Android is being specifically targeted. This is an economy attracting some of the best talent. There is a 0% unemployment rate in the security industry, and there is actually a lot of money to be had in creating exploits, which is why we, their victims, are hard-pressed to fight against it. So some of the recommendations are those that I mentioned before, making sure you're patched, making sure you turn on two-factor authentication. But when it comes to just the variety of pieces of malware, really the security industry is keeping up by offering now new technologies when it comes to detection. It used to be signature-based antivirus was the minimum requirement. And then a few years ago, sandboxing became the minimum requirement when it comes to detecting malware. That is 2015. Sandboxing being the minimum requirement, you can no longer trust sandboxing alone to block today's malware, which is why the new active content analysis, AI predictive malware protection from a lot of the new vendors or being bought by the existing vendors to do more analysis than sandboxing can do. In fact, file standardization has been around for a while now, and it really has not taken off because of previous versions' intrusive nature. But now, more recent companies coming out with more recent capabilities for file standardization, being able to take a file, strip the activeware, and pass it on, and not doing it blindly, but with dynamic policy, makes it possible to actually, for the first time, deploy file standardization within your environment to screen files coming from unknown places. So like I said before, the innovation is now in evasion. So a piece of malware must pass so many barriers to finally reach its target. It has to get through, for example, multiple mail servers. It has to get through the user. It has to get through the desktop malware protection. It may need to go out to the cloud to download some malware, and that needs to get back down. And so, all the innovation that we saw last year had to do with each of these steps. So a single piece of malware written to bypass all these multiple layers of defense. Something we noticed a long time ago is the fact that 99% of malware signatures are seen just once. And that's essentially because every malware file that's sent out is customized with a different hash, which is one of the reasons why signature-based antivirus was kind of considered dead a few years ago. But now, malware is becoming context-aware. When a file comes in, it's now being scanned by a lot of the sandboxing tools we know and love. But some of these pieces of malware know that they're in a sandbox and refuse to trigger. So they are learning to evade sandboxing tools. We're also seeing more sophisticated, more customized phishing techniques to bypass that user. And we'll get into that more of that detail later. But this is where the innovation is happening. A lot of the tools are the tools to get through the sandboxing and so on is coding, whereas the new phishing techniques are pretty impressive customization of using the personalized information, big data analysis from a lot of the recent attacks in order to target particular users. And then, of course, when a piece of malware needs to go out and find something on a particular host in the cloud, no longer is it a single command and control system with literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of, for example, compromised WordPress sites, perfectly legitimate sites that might be under the control of a malicious attacker, might use those sites as a one-time host so that the URL blocking tools, essentially signature-based tools to block malicious URLs, no longer capable. So then, that last step, we noticed that when downloading code from some of these malicious systems, it depends on who connects, who downloads when it comes to the variety of the downloaded software. They are customizing the software based upon who is actually clicking. So from end to end, there is a very sophisticated technique, as sophisticated as the most advanced marketing tool when it comes to identity management. So just to give you one example of some of the advanced schemes to bypass tools is the Mailsploit example that was described recently. And it uses a vulnerability that is literally decades old, but is still around in over 30 mail clients. And what it does is allows the attacker to display pretty much any name or email. And so it could be the person's boss, it could be the person's wife. The key being that because of this vulnerability, there is no way to tell from the user's point of view that it is not that individual. In fact, because it's embedding code within the header to hide that name, that same capability can be used to hide malicious code that will run in a browser. So this is, again, attacks on some of the mail suites, so that if mail is open within some of the more recent browsers, mail browsers, that code might be run from the header. What makes this so scary is the fact that it bypasses a lot of the schemes that were invented over the last decade or so to prevent exactly this type of spoofing. It passes DKIM, it passes DMARC filters. So even the most savvy user, even the most savvy mail filter will trust the sender. In fact, we found that instead of embedding code, it's mostly used to send malicious URLs, which people are most likely to click on because that email has passed most every trust measurement system that we have in place. So how do we prevent this? How do we block this? Well, first, we've always believed in multi-layer defense in depth. So at each of these stages is a possible place in which to identify and block this malware. The key thing is that we want to use different technologies at each layer. So if you're picking a name at random using Semantic or Kaspersky on your desktop, you want to make sure that that same code or that same signature database is not being used elsewhere in the pipeline because it's redundant. In fact, because a particular piece of code might be written to bypass sandbox X, you probably do not want to use the same technology at other layers within this path. So that the key thing is that when an attacker writes code to bypass all of these various hurdles, that is a challenge, an expensive challenge on their end. Your job is to add that one additional hurdle, that one additional challenge along the way to make it too expensive for that person to attack your company. And the best way to do that is to find additional pieces of security that complement what's already there, complement what Office is already providing, for example. And then, of course, when it comes to the user, this is where advanced technologies for anti-phishing can actually wake up the user or interact with the user or actually carry on a dialogue with the user in order to find those suspicious pieces of email and actually get them involved. So we found that actually with some of the tools that follow these recommendations, we are actually able to catch the Mailsploit attack. So the next type of attack that is becoming much more pervasive, it moves beyond file detection. And it's the now new fileless malware attacks. These are either URL embedded code or PowerShell WMI scripts that run in place, run in memory. There is no file involved, nothing saved to the drive, nothing running, and or embedded JavaScript. And what's scary is the fact that back to the evasion techniques, a lot of this can be obfuscated so that it's literally impossible not only for a human to read, but a challenge for a signature-based system to identify. The only way to understand it is actually to run it in order for it to self-compile the code and run in place. So these attacks are hard to detect and actually require that much more sophistication to block. And so, of course, when it comes to recommendation to defend against these, updating your patches, of course, but I think key thing is not relying on commodity protection, because again, this code is designed to bypass the commodity protection of the mail provider, the commodity protection that might be on the desktop. And so this is where it does pay to pay attention to the new, young, innovative companies that have defenses against the latest attacks. So this is one reason why you need to actually know and understand your SaaS security technology so that you're not spending money deploying redundant capabilities. By being able to pick and choose, swap out security tools, you can avoid that. So these are the attack vectors. Now, when it comes to the most popular vector, suite-based phishing is now the leading attack vector. Phishing, of course, is responsible for 49% of breaches in 2017. There was no malware involved. It was essentially a phishing-based attack. a subset of that, but the largest subset of that is suite-based phishing, essentially going after the G Suites and the Office suites, those tools that we usually buy as a package. The reason why it's most likely a leading attack vector is, one, it's well understood email technology. The attackers know Office 365, they know Gmail. Now, it's true that Office 365 and Gmail do have the most sophisticated defenses when it comes to protecting their users, but it is an arms race. The real challenge that Office 365 and Gmail have is actually the trust they have in their own services. In that, as a suite, files and users, conversations happen between email, between the file services, between the document engines, and so on. And that fluidity allows the attacker to take advantage of the user's habitual trust in the suite, in that pretty much on a daily basis, a user is moving back and forth between these different tools, being asked to log on to these various tools. Many times the suite vendor might pass them to a third-party tool that may look like an Office login, for example, and that's when the user who has been trained to log in multiple times a day might easily be phished. In fact, a couple of examples came. First, recent attacks that went particularly after SafeLink's defenses, SafeLink being Office 365 defense against malicious URLs. Essentially, that attack was based upon the notion that SafeLinks replaces the user's URL. So if you look at the difference between these two links, one of them is a SafeLink that goes to UPS, and the other is a SafeLink that goes to a malicious site. And it's impossible for a user, because of the way SafeLinks works, to actually allow the user to identify which one of those might be the malicious link. In fact, the next step for the attacker is to not only abuse the user's trust in Microsoft, but Microsoft's trust in its own services. A recent SharePoint attack pointed users to a malicious file within SharePoint. So because, one, Microsoft by default trusted that SharePoint file, and so slightly more relaxed when it came to the analysis of that URL. Two, the user's trust in that it's a Microsoft site. So a very careful analysis of that URL says it's a Microsoft site, so that makes perfect sense. However, clicking on that downloaded malware. So every step of the way, that abuse in Microsoft's trust and the user's trust in Microsoft allowed the attacker to put malware in the desktop of the users. So what are the recommendations when it comes to this type of attack? First of all, multi-layer phishing protection. Now, phishing protection has become so pervasive that the old way of just monitoring inbound attackers has changed, because the attackers might be inside. So you need to monitor inbox and the outbox in case there's an internal attacker who is attacking your partners or customers, as well as internal email. And so where a lot of the suite vendors' security breaks down is in that internal traffic, in that internal trust, so that the phishing protection needs to extend to that. Now, phishing is beyond just fooling the user. In fact, because it's now the vector for pretty much every type of attack, this is where the full stack security is absolutely necessary, in that every file should be measured with multiple types of signature-based tools. Sandboxing is still a valid way to detect zero-day attacks. This is where the new advanced AI malware protection becomes important. But even further, URL emulation and sandboxing. So many phishing attacks take a URL to a malicious website, to a malicious file. Now, all of those same tools that we've used for an incoming file, we now need to throw at those outgoing requests. So if a URL goes to a file, it needs to be scanned in the same way that a download file would be. Now, URL emulation, URL sandboxing. If that link goes to a form, does that form emulate a trusted site? Can we look at that form automatically and say that looks like a Microsoft site, it's not a Microsoft site, and deny the user access? Now, all of those things are not only vital at the first instance, but because of the new attack methods in which an attacker might take a perfectly legitimate web server and turn it malicious later, or a piece of malware might be seen as benign, but later analysis determines that that is not benign. Post-inbox protection is now the new requirement, in that it might get passed, but 30 seconds later, 10 minutes later, might be identified as malicious, in which case, whatever protection you have must be able to block after the fact. Either reach into that mailbox and pull that email out, or prevent the user from taking the next step, clicking on the link. So these are the attacks we've described so far. Seem familiar to us, and it's just a lot more of the same, slightly different targets. But where our attackers have become, or what 2017 has kind of proven, is that for the last few years, the attackers have actually been very patient. Many of the breaches in 2017, they were actually only discovered in 2017. It turns out the attackers had actually been in place for months, if not years, before. So we expect, and now we know ahead of time, that we are now facing a patient attacker. These are low and slow attacks that may already be in your environment. For example, we all know about the Equifax attack, but where has that data gone? How's it being used? Well, it won't be used in one big attack. It's going to be low and slow, probably next year's tax season. But the point being that we can't expect the headlines to warn us of the next attack. The next attack will be discovered years, or maybe even months, if not years, after the actual breach. Many attacks now are beachhead attacks, in which case they're not going after your entire network, they're going after one user, and then going from that user to the next user until they find the place or the file or the access they require. And what's important is the fact that many of these things are automated. These are one-time attacks. So instead of trying to attack 100 of your users, it'll attack one and wait. Nothing happens, it'll attack two and wait. And then when it gets to that 23rd attack, the 23rd victim, and that user bites, the attack is stopped, so that you may not detect that initial breach. Or that initial breach is invisible to you because they've found those credentials elsewhere. But the key part is that they may already be inside, and they may be, which means that you have an additional burden to identify the attacker. And the other thing that's happened is that in 2017 is that those patient attackers have actually already been replaced by AI-based interactions. So instead of one attacker sitting in front of a computer, maybe monitoring a dozen different attacks, he may be monitoring thousands of attacks based upon AI tools. In fact, here are some of the tools that they use in order to do their low and slow internal breach. One is an example of the alternate inbox method. So by one way or another, an attacker has gained access to a user's email account. They use inbox rules to hide that activity. So in this example, the attacker actually sends from the trash folder. When they send, either another user or externally, doesn't matter, they use these filters so that when the victim replies, it goes straight to the trash folder. Why that's important is that they can actually carry on a long-term, multi-week conversation with multiple employees, and the actual owner of that Gmail account or Office 365 account won't see it because all those conversations are in the trash. And they actually may work remotely in the fact that they can open an API account so that those sends and receives are actually done without actually having to log in. So not only is it working from within the organization, but there is actually no login event to identify. Once that API connection is open, all the sends and receives and uploading and downloading are done through basically through an API that is most likely not monitor logged. So here's an example of kind of the AI concern, or the use of AI in a recent attack, in that this was an automated email dialogue, but it could as well have been through Slack or Teams or any other messaging system. And the attack was this: hey Chris, are you still in the office? And wait. And so there is nothing, no scanner, no system would be able to read that and find something malicious. What's important is not what's being said or the actual message, but the behavior not only of the user, but also of the conversation at the other end. So it's not what's said in this conversation, it's what happens afterwards. When the end user somehow convinced Chris that this was somebody new, and was now essentially doing his bidding via remote control. So the recommendations for 2018 are to start looking at event behavior monitoring. Event behavior monitoring is now the new IPS. It's not really how they get in, it's not the tools they use to get in, it's what happens when they do. Monitoring every user, monitoring every file, monitoring every permission, and taking that information and either monitoring it through an anomaly detection engine or some sort of behavior monitoring system, or even just your existing SIM. You probably have many of the tools already in your data center across your network in order to analyze these events. The goal now is to include the cloud in that monitoring and reporting. Another recommendation is to now consider something called shadow SaaS. You're probably already familiar with shadow IT, and that is a user within your network or from home using an unapproved SaaS. You use Box, they're using Dropbox. You use Office 365, they're using Yahoo Mail. That's shadow IT. Shadow SaaS is something actually a little bit scarier in the fact that a user, for benign reasons or not, connects your existing SaaS, your approved and trusted SaaS, to a third-party application, third-party SaaS. And so you're familiar with opening up a document and maybe using, let's say, Lucidchart or some sort of charting tool to add to your Office 365 environment in order to get work done. Fantastic. Unfortunately, that is a trusted third-party SaaS that may be very similar to an untrusted third-party SaaS that's connected in exactly the same way and the same ease of use. So these are the methods by which these silent attackers are connecting third-party tools to your environment. So knowing what's connected, identifying shadow SaaS, and allowing or denying only trusted third-party tools is the best way to defend against that. And then finally, we talk a lot about email when it comes to phishing. Email is the most pervasive attack vector, always has been. But now there are other communication avenues within your environment. And those tools are actually trusted even more by your users than email, which has a bad reputation. But it's just as possible to send malware, just as possible to send phishing links through Slack, through Teams. So in 2018, your phishing protection needs to extend beyond email. It needs to extend through all of your communication channels because those are just as viable attack vectors as email was last year. So let's kind of review some of those recommendations in the different categories. In that, for 2018, when it comes to protecting your cloud, you have multiple clouds, but you can't manage them in one at a time, especially since users are traveling through them pretty seamlessly. So we recommend centralized monitoring, policy, and reporting across all your SaaS, so that now you can extend those security policies that you are now subject to in your own data center with the cloud, so that not only can you monitor compliance, but you can enforce those security requirements that you need to stay safe. Now, we covered this before when it comes to offering full stack multi-technology malware detection and sanitization. We always hate to say the best defense is just more defense, but what we're finding is that the attackers are relying on us having only a single technology, only multi-technology, using multiple algorithms or using different ways of looking at malware. We're finding that we can actually detect the latest threats. Like I mentioned, anti-phishing tools across all communication channels. And then, this is key, an automated workflow and user remediation system. Why is that important? Right now in the security industry, we have essentially a 0% unemployment rate, which means that as these threats expand, as more and more attackers have easier access to tools, we're just seeing an acceleration continue into 2018 when it comes to needing to respond. And the only way to respond is through an automated system. As soon as we get a human involved in that conversation, we've lost our timeliness of defense. So our goal is to be future-proof, so that we might be able to protect what happened in 2017. Hopefully we can protect what's coming in 2018, but a year from now when we have the same conversation, there might be additional tools we need to attack those threats that we only discover next year. So what I'd like to recommend is what we at Avanan call security orchestration for the cloud. This is Avanan's cloud security platform. And we actually provide a lot of the capabilities that we recommend for entering the new year. Full stack security, from malware sandboxing, antivirus, file sanitization, SIM integration, data leak protection, anomaly detection, but in a suite of tools under one orchestration policy engine, so that there's a single pane of glass for all of your SaaS environment. So every user, every file, every event, every policy change can be seen in one place, and policy can be set in one place, so that you can, when a new compliance regime comes, you can enforce those compliance rules from a single pane of glass. But more importantly, when it comes to the new attack vectors, complete defense in depth security, so that when you want to add multiple layers of malware detection, antivirus, sandboxing, AI protection, anti-phishing, data leak prevention, access control, and so on, that it's as easy to add as an app. That's what Avanan provides. The ability to provide that defense in depth security, not only to defend against what happened in 2017, but with the flexibility to add the tools necessary when new threats arrive in 2018. The way we do that is we connect via API to your existing ecosystem. from Office to Azure to Amazon, Box, Salesforce, whatever you're using in the cloud, SaaS or IaaS, no matter how your users are connecting, we're totally out of band. We connect via API, and then to provide those layers of security, we have partnered with all the major trusted vendors to provide over 60 different security tools, from sandboxing, malware detection, data leak prevention, encryption, endpoint compliance, file sanitization, and so on. And these are not only the most trusted names, but also the newest names you might not have heard of. So that, for example, there was a time when no one had heard of Silence. It was the newest, most advanced way to protect against attacks that sandboxing could not detect. What's nice is that when new technologies arrive, we can add them to the platform, so that we always have the latest defense. In fact, for most of the tools that are on our platform, this is actually the only way in order to deploy, you can deploy their technology in the cloud. When you are wanting to secure the cloud, you can choose the existing security tools that the cloud provides. So Office 365, for example, offers its own advanced threat protection, its own sandboxing capabilities. And in fact, we might even recommend it, but we would want to recommend more advanced tools that complement and use a different technology. And how do you choose that? Well, that's where our platform benefits you, in the fact that you don't actually need to search or vet all of those tools. They're all in one place, and they are deployed in one place, that one pane of glass, so that you can, in fact, flip a switch, turn it on, and each of these are deployed as a cloudified zero management version. So you actually never see the management engine for Sophos or Agari. They're all pre-configured tools, engines that run headless. You flip a switch, and now you have the best checkpoint sandboxing protection, the best Palo Alto protection, without having to configure anything. These are the industry leaders, most trusted names, and names you may not have heard of. But we vet each of them to ensure that before we add something to our platform, we test to make sure that it actually adds value. It's not redundant technology or has redundant detection capabilities to what we already have on the platform. So advanced email protection that goes above and beyond what Office provides, or above and beyond what you may have on your desktop. So the idea is that this is a good place to add another layer of security that you may not already have somewhere along the attack chain. We have customers that would love to share their feedback with you if you're interested, but I think the most important way, the best way for you to understand what we do and how we do it is to try our system, because we meet all of those needs, monitoring everything, providing that full stack of tools with the most advanced anti-phishing protection that uses over 230 factors per message in order to identify attacks, even the Metasploit attack that we described earlier. This is many-fold increase over what other anti-phishing tools that only we can do, because we're actually leveraging our third-party partners to do a deeper recursive analysis than is possible with a single engine. With that automated workflow, we can identify a threat, respond to a threat, interact with the user, and remediate an attack without getting IT involved, so that we meet that automation requirement needed to attack the volume of attacks that not only did we see in 2017, but we expect to continue into 2018. This is the best way to build a policy across multiple SaaS, so that you can understand, monitor, and control your cloud in the same way that you control your own data center. And because we've partnered with existing and future providers, we offer that future-proof flexibility, so that when we have this conversation a year from now, we'll have added the tools to address the new threats that are discovered in 2018. So before we go to questions, I'd like to make this offer to everyone that's on the call, and that is the opportunity to rest easy this new year. We're offering full account access, a full account until January of 2018, and this not only includes our policy engine, the ability to monitor across your SaaS, but also the ability to see the full security from all of our vendors, turn everything on. You can see the existing policy workflow tools. You can automate those that concern you, either in monitor mode so that you just know what's going on, or if you'd like to sleep through the new year, active protection to protect against those attacks that we might see early in the year. So if you go to avanan.com/futureproof, we'll make that available to you. But this is the best way to understand what we do and how to respond to the threats in 2018. So what I'd like to do is take a few questions. And again, I apologize for the audio problems at the beginning, which is the most of your questions. But we can, one of the questions is how we can get a copy of the presentation. Can definitely make that available to you. The actual presentation with the first few minutes edited out will be available, and we'll send that link to everyone. So there are a couple of questions about the technology that you have. So the first one is, when it comes to these security tools, do I need to have these security tools in my data center in order to deploy them in the cloud? And the quick answer to that is no, in that we have cloud-based versions, cloudified versions of these tools, totally independent to what you already have, so that you can now actually deploy complementary capabilities in your SaaS. So the next question actually has to do with the routing of traffic, and I think because of that question, I need to kind of clarify something that I may not have made clear in the presentation, and that is how we deploy. So there are two ways that other security systems might reroute traffic. It's possible that if you have some sort of CASB or proxy-based system in which you reroute your user traffic to go to the cloud, or you might have an MTA-based email system in which you are rerouting traffic, you're rerouting your email through an MTA. We do neither of those things. We connect totally out of band, and there is no redirection of your users or redirection of your email. So in that case, it's 100% API. So one of the questions about how you address shadow IT. So I'm hoping that I made it clear how we manage shadow SaaS, and that is the ability to block unknown or untrusted SaaS from connecting to your trusted SaaS via the cloud-based API. But shadow IT, your users using unapproved SaaS from their desktops, we actually, even though we're 100% cloud-based, we protect against that as well, and we actually do that in an innovative way. One, we connect to your existing firewall. So we partner with all the major firewall vendors so that there's no reason to redirect your traffic through another proxy or another tool. We connect to your existing firewall to identify that, not only to see what your users are using, but also to enforce policy. Another innovative way we do that is actually to monitor the users' not only email but also activity in the cloud to identify the signatures of someone using a third-party SaaS, maybe not directly cloud to cloud, but indirectly through the desktop. So see if you have any other questions. One question is about the client. No, there is no client. There is no client on the PC. There is no box in the data center. There is no and no proxy in the cloud. So everything is done 100% in the cloud, which means that we are cloud-based. Your SaaS, of course, your IaaS, your Amazon, your Office are all in the cloud. We connect directly to that, and we see every user, every file, every event, every login, every change in policy, every change in behavior, every edit that takes place. And we can enforce the malware, the data leakage, the other tools all in the cloud. There's no need to have a client. Now, with that said, we have partnered with some endpoint compliance tools. So my previous company, Forescout, is one of the best endpoint compliance, endpoint policy companies. And this allows us to work with an existing client that you may already have on the desktop in order to enforce that end-to-end policy. So it's an additional capability that leverages the best of both worlds. So a good question about licensing, and a parallel question about what if you already own some of these tools. Those are both good questions. So one way to think of us is that we are essentially an app store for security. So you purchase our platform, and then when it comes to choosing the tools you'd like, we don't make money on those third-party tools. But we handle all the licensing, we handle all the management, we handle all the deployment for you. So when you flip that switch, yes, it's an additional cost, but one, we convert the Palo Alto or Checkpoint or Sophos licensing to a per user per month licensing that you're familiar with, so that you don't need to deal with all that paperwork. Everything is done invisibly for you. Because of that licensing model, because of the scalability of the cloud, this is actually the cheapest way, the most efficient way, and the easiest way to deploy any of these tools in the cloud. To try to reproduce this in your data center, you wouldn't be able to do it at this scalability and at this pricing. So we handle all the pricing, we handle all of the licensing, we handle all of the deployment, and literally just flipping a switch. So there are some other questions, but I want to be sensitive to time. So I thank you, everyone, for joining. Again, go to avanan.com/futureproof, and we'll offer you that free account until January 31st, so you can learn more about what we do and rest easy over the new year. So again, happy holidays, happy new year.